Let's give this a practical application. So let's take something for which we have a policy. Maybe let's look at illegal drugs, right? And people will argue that it's easy to get addicted to drugs. In other words, people typically have a very inelastic demand schedule for drugs. So let's take that at the limit and let's say we have a perfectly inelastic demand schedule, which arguably is not true. I've already made that case, but fair enough. Now, what do you think the supply schedule for drugs looks like? Let's say that we have a supply schedule that looks like that. Something like that. So what happens if to the quantity demanded in this theoretical case when we increase the cost to the consumers? We increase the cost to them by putting them in jail, etc. What happens is no change to the quantity. They have lexicographic preferences. They have this extreme weird situation. They're totally irrational, which in effect is the implicit argument people are making. So there will be no change here. What will happen, on the other hand, if we put drug dealers in jail and prosecute them and maybe even kill some of them along the way? Is, in effect, that would shift our supply schedule up. So before, this would be the total revenue that drug dealers would be capturing. And now, this would be the total revenue that drug dealers are capturing. There's been no change in the quantity. There's been no change in the number of people using drugs. However, the amount of revenue that drug dealers are now collecting has gone up, which means what? Drug dealers now have more resources to spend on guns, on other ways to hide drugs in shipments, on bribes to police or customs agents. So basically, this policy in this extreme setting has yielded what? It's yielded corruption of the justice system. It's yielded more violence in communities. That violence may be directed at police. It may not. It may just be directed at other drug dealers. However, typically in those communities, that violence tends to spill over into the larger community. So does this sound like a good idea? No, I really don't think it sounds like a good idea. Right? We've achieved no policy objective. We've reduced drugs not at all. Now let's take another look at let's make this a bit more realistic. Now we can apply the same idea to supply here in a moment, but let's take let's go ahead and do that. Do you think the supply of drugs is fairly elastic or fairly inelastic? Supply is a little squishier. What drives the elasticity of supply? Basically, it boils down to how easy is it to increase production. So in other words, if we have a relatively elastic supply schedule, that would say that as a small change in price is going to yield a large change in quantity. Maybe I'll erase this demand schedule for just a second. We can again do the same thing. This is supply schedule A. This is supply schedule B. Let's just assess them at the same point here. Again, if we're going to move away from assessing them at the same point, we're going to have to bring in some math. We're going to have to figure out some other stuff here. That's something that sometimes I cover in my intermediate micro class, but oftentimes we hand wave away from that because, again, the benefit of doing that versus the cost of doing that is a little bit, right? We can get a long ways down the road here. So if we put this same, I'm just going to exaggerate it here. We increase the price by so we're at this point. This would be the same percent. This would be the same force that we're putting on. In good A, we have this much response. In good B, we have that much response. So here we have a situation where the elasticity of A is smaller than the elasticity of B. Incidentally, sniff test, as you may guess, elasticity, the price elasticity of supply here is the percent change in quantity over the percent change in price. Yay. Pattern recognition, same formula. However, if you ever get a negative sign for a supply price elasticity, you've done something wrong. You broke our law of supply. So if you think about the supply for drugs, do you think it is relatively elastic or relatively inelastic? I would argue that the supply of heroin and the supply of cocaine it's relatively elastic. It actually isn't that hard to grow more heroin. It's not that hard to grow more cocaine. It's not that costly. It might take a little while, although I think they grow fairly easy. It's sort of like marijuana. How elastic is the supply schedule for marijuana? It's pretty elastic. And so let's take a situation where we have a very inelastic demand schedule and an elastic supply schedule. And so let's say we increase, so we would expect to be right there. So let's take a situation where what's going to happen if we start putting people in jail who buy drugs, who are addicts? What's going to happen? There will be no change in demand, because what we will in effect be doing is driving up the cost of them. While that seems like that's going to change the demand schedule, if you go down our list of determinants, the only thing that's changing is cost. We will move along our demand schedule. So maybe we're there. And along the way, maybe we increase the cost to the suppliers. And again, what's happened? We have seen a small reduction in the number of people taking drugs, but we have seen a large increase in the revenue of drug dealers. Probably not a great thing, right? I would argue. But let's say that we say, oh, look, this reduction in the quantity is totally worth it. Okay, is there an alternative? Is there another way we could get this same reduction without handing more money to drug dealers with which they can shoot each other, they can shoot the police, they can shoot innocent bystanders, they can bribe the cops, they can dig tunnels under borders through which terrorists can also get in, right? Is there any other way we could do this? I hope some of you are sitting at home saying, well, sure, there's a way we could drive the cost up to the consumers without increasing the cost to the suppliers, in effect, not having this happen, and thereby could we tax this? Could we legalize heroin, regulate its sale to make sure that minors don't get it? And we may hate, we might really think that the use of drugs is corrosive to society. However, instead of drug dealer revenue going up, drug dealer revenue stays the same, and we have this much loss in well-being instead of all of this. And we also have tax revenue. We have money that we can do something else with in society.